This is the second time that Elon and I are doing this live back and forth here on Substack. We're really continuing to test out the best time to do this. When can people actually join? What's convenient? We're going to do one, I think, next Monday is going to be our next effort. See what the difference is between a Monday and a Tuesday, a little earlier in the day. We will settle into a regular weekly time, though, by the end of the month, and we will then hold to them. Neither Elon or I will host. We may have some guests. We'll sometimes do it the two of us, but we will have a regular time that you will be able to get into your calendars and know that we're going to be there. There's no shortage, Elon, of what to talk about. We could, probably do this daily, unfortunately, but definitely hope to get into a regular pattern. We also do record these discussions. So on the Word on the Street homepage on Substack, there's a podcast button. And if you click on that, you'll always be able to catch whatever conversations have been uploaded over the course of time. And if you do miss it, you'll be able to join us there. So Elon, the big debate last time was, what should we call this? We got a lot of input. You want to do the big reveal?
Okay, I think we are going to go with Heard on the Street, which is a nice combination with the Word on the Street. I know Jeremy was very strongly leaning towards, the wonk and the hack, which I continue to believe, while is charming and fun and can be like the kind of under kind of like the secondary, Jeremy, I think you're just underselling yourself by calling yourself the hack, but I think you're embracing and loving it. So
I embrace that side of my background, and we'll definitely probably break down our discussions over the course of time, with me focusing a little bit more on the politics and the domestic angle here at home, and then you focus more on the policy and the substance of what's going on, and you recently, one of the reasons that we haven't done this for a couple of weeks and we had to take a little bit of a break is we were both traveling, and you were off in Israel leading one of our delegations. I think you wrote about that in your recent Substack. So, I think this was the second J Street trip that you had been on. The last one, you were a participant 5-6 years ago. When was it?
Yeah, so this is, and actually one thing I should say before that, because one other thing I forgot to say is a new name I came up with today, which is like two Jewish guys with like glasses and blue shirts, is also another now contender for names.
We did not coordinate this. We did not.
We would have done the opposite of not coordinate.
Yeah. Exactly.
But no, look, in terms of I came on a trip with you in 2019, right? And that was, look, I've been to Israel many times since, but what was, I think, really interesting for me to go on this trip versus that one, and really kind of sad, is when I went in 2019, the whole point of these trips is, first you go and you visit, Tel Aviv, and you talk to Israelis and you really hear the Israeli side of it and learn the Israeli narrative. And then you go to Jerusalem, you go, at least in 2019, we went and overlooked Gaza. You go into the West Bank and you hear that the other narrative. In 2019, that experience was hearing from the Israeli side that, at the end of the day, at the end of the day, we want a partner and we want peace, but if we're just going to keep living our lives here and things will be fine if we can't get to a deal. And we're kind of just going to ignore the things that are happening 10, 5, 20 miles away. That was not, obviously J Street would expose people to, those making the very strong argument that this is not sustainable, this is not going to work. But you could tell that's where Israeli society was. And then you go to the Palestinian side and you see how horrible it was there to live under occupation, to go to places like Hebron. And you kind of come away frustrated, pretty angry with the Israelis. Your life is so good, for Palestinians, this is such a tough situation. The difference now, tragically, I think, and horribly, is, all those warnings about how this wasn't sustainable are real. And now when you go, and after the mass of October 7th, you really experience the horror that both sides are going through. You go to Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, you spend time at one of the kibbutzim that was attacked on October 7th, and and time at the Nova film festival or music festival, which has now become like a memorial site. And wow, that was some hard stuff. I had not done some of that since October 7th. It was really hard. I was there with congressional chiefs of staff. And then you still go see all the horrible things happening in the West Bank. And even though you're not even talking to people in Gaza, like everybody in the West Bank has family in Gaza and friends in Gaza, as well as some of the, Palestinians or Arab Israelis, however they choose to identify themselves, living in Israel, who also have those connections into Gaza. So it's just, um, yeah, it's very different. It's like a lot tougher of a trip, frankly, in all the wrong ways, unfortunately. But this is kind of where we are at. The only other thing I'll say, on this is I did feel, despite how hard it was, like I did feel like Israeli society is very much in the wrestling phase. I kind of compare my experience, like our experiences, like with the Iraq War, and kind of the early years after October 7th, or after. See, I always do this. September 11th and October 7th always mix in my mind, unfortunately. Um, like it feels like Israeli society is at that point now, where they're really wrestling with things. There's a lot of like lack of clarity about where things go, but I think most of the Israeli public and people you talk to are like, look, like if getting the hostages out means ending the war, like that we're okay with that. Like that's what we want to do. Um, and the other thing is you just have reservists and people you're talking to are going again and again and again, and like husbands and fathers and, children, sons, especially also women, but it's mostly men. Like the whole society is feeling it. And they're like, what are we doing this for? It doesn't mean they're like ready to jump on like peace with Palestinians tomorrow. I think there's a lot of complexity.
I mean, that was one of my questions for you, is whether or not there is the beginning of an awakening in the Israeli public about what has happened to Gaza. I mean, is there any connectivity, the humanity of the situation, of the suffering that's happening? Are you beginning to see that awaken? Could you see evidence of that?
There's more of it, right? So we went to a protest on Saturday night in Tel Aviv, and with the hostage families and others, and you have a group of folks kind of on the side with like pictures of like Palestinian children who were killed in Gaza. um, and the good news is, like, talking to some of our colleagues who go to these protests every week, like that number is growing. How many people are out there doing that is growing, and like the dialogue is growing, and people um like Ehud Olmert and Ehud and like Boogie Alone and others like are starting to raise their voices and say, like Olmert said, right, has written that like Israel's committing war crimes, right? Like things are changing, but like it's not going to happen immediately, and it's going to take time. And as a society, they're also not there yet completely. There's also like polling that shows that the majority of Israelis are okay with like pushing all Palestinians out of Gaza. And then you have other polling that shows that like 65% would support the ability to for a Palestinian state as part of a deal. Like if it involved like, normalization of Saudi Arabia, end of the war, hostages out, and all the other things. Um so I think that, like, again, like society is overall like in a really mixed spot. I will also say, Jeremy, like I wasn't the only one on a trip, right? You were also on a trip. Very interesting. You wrote about this being in Vienna with your family. I'm interested in kind of your take from what you took from your travels.
Yeah, no, it's a completely different trip. It was totally a personal trip. I did write about it in my Substack from this weekend, so if folks didn't have a chance to see that, you can also find that on our homepage, Word on the Street. Um, and it was very, very moving. My family fled, as I discovered. Many people probably watching this, and certainly many people who engage with J Street, have this similar story that I think it was something like 2/3 of Vienna's Jews fled Vienna in the months after the Anschluss and before what I've always grown up calling Kristallnacht in November of 1938. was just a mass exodus. And that was exactly when my family left. And this was my first opportunity to take my children to Vienna, and we turned it into a whole family reunion. We took a bunch of cousins and had a personal tour guide sort of walk us through our family addresses, and we visited some of the key historical sites in the Jewish experience in Vienna. So it was very, very moving as a sort of exploration of roots. Um, but certainly the whole time I was there, because of what I do and just because of who I am, I couldn't help but let my mind go to the question of displacement and the question of losing your home and the question of what return looks like, what it looks like to go back and see the place that was your parents that you were forced to leave. I think that is really relevant to the question of how Jews and how Israelis think about the way that Palestinians look at 1948. And they look at their grandparents or their parents' family experience and where they grew up. I visited the synagogue where my grandparents were married. I went to the schoolhouse where my mother was educated, and I couldn't help but think about the families who can't do that and can't visit the places of their own family origin. And my hope out of all of this is that one day there will be the ability of Jewish people to recognize that Palestinians do have a heritage and a connection to the land on which the Jewish people have now established the state of Israel, and that connection is real. It needs to be honored, and there needs to be remembrance of it and acknowledgement of that history. And that's happened for the Jewish people in Austria. I can, if I want, become a citizen of Austria again because my mother was one. I can get my mother was able to get reparations. Property that was taken away was repatriated. I'm not saying that has to happen in this context. It's not the way it's going to play out. I know that some would like that to be the way, but I think the acknowledgement of what happened is key, and some form of reparation, some form of uh, closing this wound. It doesn't close it completely, but there has to be that process. And so that all was going through my mind because I do feel like, I'll never get past the anger, never get past the grief about the tragedy. But having these kinds of mechanisms in place for reconciliation and acknowledgement does allow you to move on and build a future.
Yeah, so, no, I think that's actually, like, talking about that and that experience, maybe, like, transitions us off of talking about our travels and actually talking, like, while you and I were both gone, I mean, you're all over the world and you're just looking at your phone and look at what's happening in, like, Washington, DC and Boulder, Colorado, and spending way too much time thinking and worrying and horrified about what's been happening here in the US. So, let's talk about that. I mean, it's been about as bad of a 2 weeks for and complicated of a 2 weeks for American Jews as we've had in, I mean, as long as I can remember. How are you feeling about all this as you're traveling around with your family in Greece and Vienna and otherwise?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, it's the Washington Jewish Museum, the DC Capitol Jewish Museum is, I think it's less than a mile from where I'm sitting right now. And the reception at which the shooting happened outside, it's a young professionals event. It happens that I know that somebody on our staff chaired that event as a young professional about a decade ago. This is a regular event. It is sponsored by a Jewish organization. It's sponsored at a Jewish venue. The shooter had no idea who the individuals were at whom he aimed. And to me, it was just clearly an act with an anti-Semitic intent. And it, exposes this incredible, just terrible space where criticism of what Israel is doing, which is completely legitimate, and opposition to what the Israeli government is doing is completely legitimate. But there's a space beyond that where a people are being held collectively responsible, and anger is allowed to, and it festers and it builds up, and it leads to moments like this, or the moment in Colorado. And people we know were at that event, right? And many people in the J Street world knew one or both of the young people who were killed. And so it is a very personal event. It has, um, you know, deep meaning within our community. Um, and I think there was also, a sense that this has been allowed to happen. And how, why is it that we aren't able to address the underlying problems here, and letting the anger over what's happening in Gaza transition into this. It's just very painful, and it's horrible, and it happened less than a mile from where I'm sitting right now.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Jeremy, one of the things, like, as I just kind of tried to sit back and think about, like, how hard of a moment this is, part of what's so disorienting, at least for me as a liberal American Jew, and I think might be for a lot of people, is like the places where we usually go for leadership and allyship in this moment, like, are all in some form like compromised or not exactly where we want them to be. So you've got, you count on the US government to fight anti-Semitism. But right now, like, anything that happens, immediately the Trump administration is jumping on this and politicizing it, and not just doing the right thing. They are saying like they're expressing their strong opposition, great, but then they're taking it a step further and using it for whatever their agenda is. Whether it's an immigration, and we'll talk in more detail about this. It just, you can't trust anything that's coming from them. You have an Israeli government who I fundamentally disagree with on so many things, including what's happening in Gaza and how they treat the Palestinians, but also Israeli democracy and so many just other elements there. Frankly, progressive allies who, really have been like, Jews have been part of that progressive coalition. I think there's been a lot of, again, positive and strong response in the last couple of weeks, but absolutely also like a feeling, over the past, really since October 7th, of at moments lack of allyship. I've written a little bit about this, or just feeling like, the immediate turn towards like ceasefire and genocide and things like that. Like, that just didn't make a lot of sense on October 8th and in the immediate, and felt like people we've been with weren't necessarily always with us. And then you add to it like, establishment Jewish organizations. The latest being like what Jonathan Greenblatt said, and we can talk more about that too. Like, this on Friday, to a group of Republican attorney generals, where he was just really mixing and match, criticism of Black Lives Matter, and like, bundling it with like, Al Qaeda and ISIS and things like that. Like, so like all these different, and the ADL is like crucially important institution. It's so
Right, the
important.
history, right? I
Yeah.
mean, this is a civil rights leader from the 1960s, right? And the legacy of the importance of that organization, and to turn around and make these kinds of blanket statements about the student protest movement and calling them terrorists, it's really, to my mind, a abdication of their leadership, and it turns it back on a tremendous legacy of an organization that's central to our community.
Yeah, and so you put all that stuff together, and it just feels like, where do we, like, there's definitely also a feeling of, where do we go, right? Like, it's just also complicated and confusing,
Well,
I
so
mean,
tell
like,
us a little bit. There was this yesterday. We come back from our various travels, and immediately in the House of Representatives, there's two different resolutions yesterday being considered by the House related to anti-Semitism. Uh, it, it won't surprise anybody who's watching this that anything that happens on this issue immediately moves into the political arena. And so these horrific incidents, there then has to be a congressional resolution, right? Why? I don't know, but there has to be. And the question is, how do you frame it? And how do you express on behalf of the Congress the national sentiment about these horrific incidents? So, Elon, there were two different resolutions. Maybe you just want to quickly outline for folks what the two were.
Sure. You want me to do that, or I thought
Yeah,
you
yeah.
want to do it, but I'll go for it. So look, we had two resolutions. One that had, you know, full support from the entire Congress, and was pushed by Representative Van Drew. And Jeremy, I'm terrible with congressional names, so the representative who actually is from Boulder, Representative
Evans. Oh, Joe Neguse. Right.
Magoo's. This was the good resolution.
Right. Okay. Got it.
Magoo's, who pushed this resolution that really like had 100% support. It called out all the various anti-Semitic like incidents, like the three key anti-Semitic incidents of the past couple months on Josh Shapiro's home here in Washington and Colorado, and really expressed strong opposition, and also made clear the importance of freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And then you had this second one from Evans, another member you know, um, of the House, a Republican, which, you know, got into all kinds of issues having to do with immigration and really used this exactly as a tool to talk about immigration, um, which was not really like and did things like equate Free Palestine, and one of the initial versions called Free Palestine an anti Semitic phrase. Um, it included language that thanked ICE for, everything that they had done in Colorado, which is nothing because they weren't even in Colorado. And at the same time that they weren't in Colorado, there was no thank you to like the Boulder Police or the FBI who actually were responding. And so, you know, uh, one resolution passed overwhelmingly. The other one still ended up passing, but with a lot more opposition from Democrats. And even included that second one even included things like, as Nagus talked about, it had a statement about reportedly one of the victims was reportedly, a Holocaust survivor, and his point was like, it's not reportedly. I am the member of Congress from that district. I talked to them. Like, it's not reportedly. Like, if you Google it and you just put it into your resolution, it's one thing. But like, they are a survivor from the Holocaust. So let's like talk about that, right? And I think it was just, yeah, the difference between playing politics on this versus playing, but I'm interested, Jeremy, like tell us a little bit more about how J Street is positioning itself in this moment, and how you think we need to be as a community responding to all this.
Yeah, well, the first thing is that we really need to call out the use of the fight against anti-Semitism as a pretext by the MAGA movement, by the Trump administration, to carry out their far-right agenda. This is something we've discussed before. It's something that J Street's really making a big part of its messaging and communications. Is that the far right has an agenda to undercut higher education, to limit immigration, to limit constitutional protections, freedom of speech, due process. There's a whole right-wing agenda, and they're using the fight against anti-Semitism as a pretext to undercut values and issues that are dear to the American Jewish community. The irony couldn't be greater. And so J Street is trying to give Congress and give public figures the language to fight back against this. We need to combat anti-Semitism. We need to address the ignorance and the misinformation, and we need to acknowledge the deep-rooted nature of a lot of these kinds of prejudices that tie into a broader agenda of hate and bigotry and racism. And we need a whole of government response, as the Biden-Harris administration put forward. But if you cherry pick a handful of third rail political priorities for a far right government, and you use as your pretext for pursuing that agenda the fight against anti-Semitism, not only is that not advancing the fight against anti-Semitism, I think that you're going to end up making anti-Semitism worse, because the people who are losing their funding for education, or who are not going to have their diseases addressed because the research grant has been cut at a leading university, and the reason somehow is tied back to the Jewish community, this is not good for the Jewish people. And so I think that we need to understand when we and our grief and our anger and our pain is being instrumentalized by folks who do not have our best interests at heart. And that's a really important part of what J Street has been doing over the course of the last, 4 months, 5 months now of the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think that's, and I'll just add to that, like one of the other things that we've also been doing at the same time is like engaging with our traditional progressive allies. Like, and I should say, like many of them, despite the like a lot of the criticism that comes at the left, like many of them have been out there very loudly and clearly over the last
Right.
couple.
Right. It's
Um,
really this. You and I discussed this. This one really irritates me, right? Because I do understand what you were saying earlier, that there were people in the wake of October 7th who didn't step up and call out what happened. And there were a lot of alliances that were frayed because there wasn't a sense of solidarity in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. But it's become a bit of a trope to say that the left isn't responding, or the Democrats aren't responding, or progressives aren't responding to anti-Semitism. I saw very, very strong statements in the wake of all of these attacks from AOC, from Pramila Jayapal, from Bernie Sanders, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, 60 organizations strong, came out with a very strong condemnation and statement. And so our allies are stepping up and they are calling out anti Semitism. And I think there's just a bit of a reflexive, it's almost become a verbal tick now in the Jewish community, where people are just saying, well, the progressive world or the Democrats or the left aren't taking this seriously and aren't speaking out. I personally am seeing it, and I think we need to make sure that people are aware that that's really happening.
yeah, no, I think that's true. And I also look, I wrote a Substack a couple weeks ago after the attack in Washington. And I was a little bit nervous on it because part of what I did do is like call out some of pro-Palestinian movement, at least for some of the language and rhetoric. And I think it's really important to distinguish between different language and rhetoric and exactly what's being said. That's a whole other conversation. But I do think that some of that language and the way it hits on the extreme elements of that movement that are like the kinds of folks who might get violent as a result, like, yeah, I think like it's important for them to also think about that language. And I was worried that writing that and also writing about really some of the challenges I had um, with engagement on the left with, and even some of our students have had, I was, where I did feel isolated or I did feel like there wasn't enough sympathy or allyship or a little bit of unconscious bias, like where Jews don't necessarily like, as a minority, don't get the benefit of the doubt that some other minorities sometimes get in those spaces in terms of like recognizing Jewish pain and concern in history. I was worried that I was gonna like frankly, like piss off a bunch of my friends on the further left. But actually, what I got from some of them was like, "Thank you, that was really important to say." And I am trying to make that case to my allies too, and to like and just having another conversation with someone in that camp today. Like, there are a lot of people in that camp who do recognize this as a problem. Um, and a concern and actually are turning and like the way to deal with it is like on this kind of stuff, it's like engagement. It's like having the conversation because this isn't like a lot of this is unconscious kind of bias, which you have to point out to people, just like you have to have that discussion as uncomfortable as it is. And you also have to be able to, in your own mind say like, what is like anti-Semitism? What is unconscious bias? What is just like uncomfortable stuff that I disagree with and don't like to hear, but like isn't really that, and so I think that that's like an important part of having that
Well,
conversation. Like,
I, you know, we've got word on the street, we've got herd on the street, we've got J Street, we got a lot of street metaphors, but I'll say this is a two-way street, right?
Mhm.
I think it is really, really important that the Jewish community needs to understand that the progressive community is not hearing enough from the Jewish community, the established Jewish community, the leadership of the American Jewish community about the suffering in Gaza, right? There is a desire from Jewish established leadership to hear from the progressive community when we are feeling pain and we are hurt. But there's a desire from the progressive community to understand that Jewish leadership gets that what's happening in Gaza is something we should be speaking out about as well. And I think that leads us into sort of the next
Yeah.
question, which is, you were just there. Tell us a little bit about what you picked up about what is actually happening on the ground right now. How is the humanitarian aid, uh, this strange idea that the Israelis have set up of having just a handful of distribution centers with American security contractors? It seems to be a disaster, with violence breaking out, people dying. What did you learn about what's happening on the ground right now in Gaza?
Sure, sure. And like I should also say, like just linking back even to that previous conversation, you and I have talked about this, like in terms of what's happening in Gaza, like it also links back to like the violence that we're facing here in the US. Like, and like we can't these things are all like enmeshed in some really
Yeah.
ugly, complicated, and horrible ways. What's happening on the ground now with this, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Like the bottom line is, this thing has now started running. I think we talked about like it was a concept a couple weeks ago when we last did this. But to remind folks, we have this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Nobody exactly knows who's funding it. The Israelis say it's an American project. The Trump administration says it's an Israeli project. Um, you know, um, there's it's designed to try to avoid a situation where like Hamas takes aid from Gaza, and takes aid and uses it for its own purpose. Now, look, you've got two kind of main priorities. Like the first one needs to be to feed the population of Gaza. You have women and children. And the second is, I think, legitimate of like concerns about like aid diversion, but like like there's still not a lot of evidence about precisely what kind of aid diversion is going on. And two, at the end of the day, like whatever it is, like the first priority must be to feed the population. And that's not just because that's the human and right thing to do, but it's also because, I mean, frankly, from a narrow Israeli perspective, like if Israel is seen as essentially starving out the population of Gaza, it really doesn't matter like how effective they are at keeping aid from Hamas. Like, they're causing themselves much more long-term damage internationally and globally. Um, but in terms of this actual mechanism, the problem is that the thing just doesn't really work very effectively. You've got like these and now like a number of very small locations, like bases in different, mostly in the South. And you've got an environment where what you're asking is thousands of Palestinians to walk potentially miles through like these narrow corridors where you've got like a lot of IDF, like young kids with, and soldiers like, 19, 20 years old with guns who don't really understand the no Palestinians. Apparently there's like the Israelis have also been arming various like gangs and
Right.
clans.
I read about that. Trying to arm another group. As I understand it, Israel in the 90s started arming Hamas, right? That's where the origin of Hamas was to take on the PA and the PLO. And this just doesn't end well. This is not a strategic
No,
thought.
no, there's only like one group you can actually like there is like a group you can arm. Like, and that's like the Palestinian Security Forces. And actually they're like pretty effective. Like, are they
Right.
perfect? No, lots of challenges, but that requires this Israeli governing coalition to support PA, you know, uh, role in Gaza and ultimately like Gaza and the West Bank, like coming back together again, which gets you on the pathway to a potential Palestinian state. All things that are completely anathema to Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir. And so instead, we're like arming these random Palestinians. And so you're creating this environment. Like, I don't know what is happening day to day. Like, who shot first? Who shot what? How many Palestinians were killed? All I know is like a lot of Palestinians are being killed around these things. Like, somebody is shooting at them, whether it's IDF or Hamas or like these other groups.
And
Like,
another armed gang that's being armed by Israel.
like we don't really have good news and information on this. But the bottom line is this whole thing doesn't work. As opposed to just prioritize like getting the aid in and having humanitarians who know how to do this and have done this, like, delivering the aid where it needs to go, which is kind of how it's gone, traditionally in these kind of environments. So we really just need to get back to that. The other thing is, like the biggest concern with Hamas is like they take this and they use it to like make a lot of money. Um,
So there's an answer to that.
Yes. Well, why don't you tell us the answer, Jeremy?
The answer is flood the zone, right? I mean, make it so that the aid is actually so abundant that there isn't the market for Hamas to actually make money from it. If you actually provided enough food and support for the population, then there wouldn't be a black market and there wouldn't be the ability for Hamas to hijack a truck here and there and make a ton of money off of selling it. So every decision here is wrong morally and wrong strategically. These things make no sense unless your goal is to prolong this war and to prolong this fight for political reasons.
Yeah, I mean, so transitioning from there though, in terms of prolonging this fight, or maybe like some hope towards ending this fight. What do you make of news in Israel about a potential change in government, Haredim? I'm interested to get your take on like
Right.
what's any hope there.
Well, I mean, this is definitely if there's any moment when this government might potentially collapse and there might be a path of going to early elections before next year, it is over this issue of the draft of the ultra Orthodox. And we're right at that moment. I think the Knesset recesses in a couple of weeks, and this bill is up for consideration that would actually allow for ultra Orthodox to be drafted into the army. And the ultra Orthodox parties have all threatened to pull out and not support the government, the opposition. I think tonight, you might have followed this today more than me, but I think there might be a motion of no confidence even tonight in the parliament. And this is the only moment when there's any chance that the government might not make it. It would be over the drafting of yeshiva students affiliated with the Sephardi and Ashkenazi political parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism. And if those two parties decide they can't stay in this government because of the draft issue, this is the one way that the government could collapse. I personally don't see it happening. These crises come along every couple of years. There's sort of a pattern to it. It goes right up to the edge. Then some way out is found. And I think the ultra Orthodox parties understand that if there are new elections, the odds are that a non far right, non Netanyahu, and probably non Haredi government gets formed again. And so it's in their interest to keep this government in place as long as possible. So, I'm happy to be proven wrong. If the government would fall tomorrow, and new elections were to happen and we could get a different leader, it would be the best thing, in my opinion, that could possibly happen to the state of Israel. But I'm not holding my breath and I'm not putting my money on it. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm kind of where you are. I've called a bunch of kind of my friends in Israel and journalists and others who I count on, like who have the best kind of feel for this. Because I never trust myself in Israeli politics. It's just so freaking complicated. But what they say is like probably they'll make it through the next few weeks and through this into the recess. But then when they come back in the kind of after the Chagim in like October, like that's when things probably will collapse. I mean, look, there has to be an Israeli election in the next by November of 2026. And so the closer you get, like the less incentive there is to keep it together. And the more every party is looking for like the ideal thing that it can jump off on together. And so, the other thing I'll say about this, and we got a question from one of our friends about this, which is, um, uh, you know, we saw reporting of Mike Huckabee jumping in and trying to work with the Haredis to, essentially keep the coalition together, which is nuts. He's also come out and denied it, I should say, but it's also nuts because, like, it's not exactly like Netanyahu is going towards a Trump administration agenda. I don't know why Huckabee's there trying to save the government, where everything Trump wants, like, would be in a better position if Netanyahu was gone. So, like, I think that's just, I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe it's like the left hand not talking to the right. I don't know what you think about this whole thing.
yeah. I mean, I saw Charlotte's comments, so thank you for that. A couple of other people, I think, commented on the Huckabee thing. And one thing you and I probably have learned over the course of decades of engaging with Israeli issues, Israeli politics, Israeli journalism is you can't believe everything you read, right? It's who knows what the source is of any particular story. So we don't know that this is actually what Huckabee did. This is a report about that. But, one does know who Mike Huckabee is, right? One does know what his agenda is. We also know that today he stated that support for the creation of a Palestinian state is no longer the policy of the United States. But then when the State Department spokesperson was asked about that at 1:00 at the presser today, the spokesperson said, well, the U.S. policy on these issues is set by the president of the United States. And, that's actually the truth. Every so often, something truthful does get said by somebody in the Trump administration. And the truth is that Mike Huckabee, as the ambassador to Israel, does not set the policy. And if there is going to be a decision that is made regarding the United States formally backing away from there being a Palestinian state, it's going to be made at the White House and not by Mike Huckabee. As much as I completely objected to the plan that was rolled out in 2020 by Trump and Jared Kushner back then, it did call for the creation of a Palestinian state. So it's not like the principle of there being a state, an independent state of Palestine, has been objectionable to Trump. And I do think that Huckabee is expressing more his personal politics there. And if he is meeting with the far right religious parties to try to get them to stay in the government, what he's doing is he's furthering the Christian evangelical agenda, the Christian Zionist agenda of ensuring a government that's going to keep Judea and Samaria with the state of Israel. In their view, the West Bank is called Judea and Samaria. They want to prevent a two-state solution. And he's been clear that's his agenda. I'm not so sure that that's the agenda of Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump, even Marco Rubio. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, no, look, and actually, I'll tell you, Jeremy, I was actually like one of the things you and I were talking about before was, I had a chance when I was out in Israel for a while to actually spend a day in the northern West Bank, like going.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
One of our experts who really like friends of J Street, who really like watches things carefully, and like we were going from just the number of like illegal outposts that have now been built since October 7th. Like you just go and like try to describe it. It's hard to like, basically these are like little trailer parks. What they do is they set up this little trailer park and then they build a fence around huge, they call it a farm, and they build a fence around huge amounts of land, much of it Palestinian land, or they cut Palestinians off so that they can't get there. And then, they plug in the electricity to the existing settlements and, infrastructure. And you just see it. You see things like huge pieces of territory just being like gobbled up. And then, Palestinian olive groves where you can clearly tell the difference between an olive grove that like Palestinians can no longer get to because like it's farmed
They're
out.
withering and dying.
Yeah, and like these are people's livelihoods. And then you have the IDF in all of this, which it's not like actively supporting, but it is because the IDF's mission is to defend Israelis. And so like it gets to the point where you have these guys going out of these lots of examples of settler violence where there's organized, these settlers go out, they go into these communities, they start to, essentially intimidate people to leave. They're clearing out areas. And the IDF goes with the settlers, and it doesn't like perform the violence itself. But if it becomes a violent confrontation that usually is triggered by the settlers, the IDF then steps in and like arrests Palestinians or just essentially backs the settlers, puts Palestinians in an impossible situation. And all of this is just happening now with this new government, like with impunity. It was one of the reasons like why in the Biden administration we pushed for sanctions like on like these violent settlers.
Right. And I saw with Seth Pollock, by the way,
Yes.
Seth asked in the chat about the sanctions that Britain and a couple of other countries just put on today against Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, actual government ministers being sanctioned by European and other governments.
Yeah. And I think it's about time. Some of us may have been, advocating for that to happen during the Biden administration. But
some of us were pushing some of us to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And look, and I think it's like really important that this happened and continuing to send those messages. I mean, frankly, sanctioning Smotrich and Ben-Gvir is is more symbolic, but the powerful message that it sends that these guys are totally, you know, just not to be accepted, and this behavior is just completely unacceptable. I think is really really important. I also think continuing to sanction the organizations that like really are perpetuating this violence and putting the money behind it is also something that's like super critical. Organizations like Amana and Regavim and others. And so I think it's good that, and frankly, like none of these countries would be doing this. I'm going to toot the Biden. I mean, Biden administration takes a lot of flack,
Shoot it gently.
but I will say that on this issue, like people like we opened the door on this and like have created a historical precedent um that like now exists and has created an opening for people to go after these guys. And I think that's important because if you really think about the history of settlements, you know, overall, this is the first mechanism like with real teeth like that we've ever had to like do this. And it does make a difference in people's lives when you cannot access your credit card and bank account. Like,
And I'll add, by the way, that Jerry Nadler has introduced legislation to put the sanctions regime into law, so that it wouldn't simply be something that one president or another can put in and then take off. And we, as J Street, are supporting the Nadler bill. We're going to be trying to run up the number of co-sponsors. And then that's a piece of legislation that when Democrats do get back into control of the House and the Senate, perhaps there'll be an opportunity to pass that actually into law so that that kind of sanctions regime that started as an executive order under Joe Biden can then be actually something permanently in American law. I think it's really important.
yeah.
By the way, I saw a question roll by. The way that this works, I get a constant stream of things flowing across the bottom of my screen, so I'm trying to catch up with what is flowing here. But somebody did ask, what do we make, and do we expect anything out of the UN France conference on the two-state solution next week? I think that starts on the 17th. So what's your experience with these kinds of international gatherings? What are you hearing? I think Nadav Tamir of J Street staff was in Paris this weekend for some preliminary meetings around that. What are you hearing about it?
I think it might be coming in a couple of days, even some of these. I'm not like it's I mean, it's always good to shine light on an issue, so I'm not gonna be pejorative. You know, I do like frankly though, like and and look, if if like MBS can actually come, which I don't think it sounds like is likely at this point, to New York as part of this. And so there's really like a message of also Arab support for this. It's very powerful. Though the Saudis, my understanding, have been very engaged. Um, Maybe there's an opportunity here to move the ball forward on some of these things, but like I don't know. I'm sorry. I get a little skeptical about the international conferences and their ability to really.
What about the idea of France recognizing a state of Palestine? Do you think that that is something? I know that a lot of people in the J Street world would like to see more countries, including the United States, one day recognize the state of Palestine. Do you think that that would do anything if Macron were to announce that next week?
I mean, I think it would move the needle, especially if MBS is there with him doing it, like and he's doing it in that context. And I think it'd send a sort of powerful international signal. I do think it's important to tie these like, recognition to like actionable steps that really move the ball forward. So for example, I'm like much more enthusiastic about like the sanctioning of Ben Gvir and Smotrich today than that, only because like that has an effect.
Yeah.
And so like, I mean, look, I like back in 2020 wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post about like the way to respond to annexation, for example, at the time was for American recognition of a Palestinian state. So it's not something I have any allergy to, and I actually think it could be the right thing to do at the right moment. I just want the French, if they're going to do it, and it's a big deal for a country like France to do it, to have a plan and follow it up with like real steps, to support the Palestinians. And they did get an interesting letter out of Mahmoud Abbas, which committed to things like potentially elections in the next year, very clear language on condemning October 7th and Hamas's behavior. So look, there are good things that will come out of this. But I also think we just need to set our expectations that
Low. Set the expectations low. So we've got a few minutes left. I know a lot of people have joined us since the beginning of I can't call it a Zoom anymore, right? And since the beginning of our broadcast. So I just want to tell folks that you are joining what is now going to be called Heard on the Street, which is the name that we've come up with for our weekly live discussions. Ilan and I are going to be co-hosting this. Sometimes it'll be the two of us in a dialogue. Sometimes we'll have a guest. We'll have people on sometimes, and it'll just be one of us or both of us. So this is experiment to see what audience reaction is like to doing something on a Tuesday afternoon. Next week, we're going to do it on a Monday afternoon. But following that, we are going to pick a regular weekly time. So you'll be able to know that Heard on the Street is going to be going live. If you miss that time, the Word on the Street homepage on Substack has a podcast link, and you'll be able to access not only the prior weeks, but all of the conversations that Ilan and I are leading and having over the weeks ahead. And that will be our home base. So thanks for tuning in to Heard on the Street. This is the first time that we're using that term, but that'll be the name of it going forward. So Ilan, I also saw in the context of things flowing across the bottom of my screen here, a question about the Iran negotiations, because not only is what you saw happening on the West Bank and what's happening in Gaza and the conference at the UN related to Israel-Palestine, but the Iran issue is on the front burner as well. The sixth round of negotiations are this weekend between the Trump team and Iran. What are you hearing about the Iran negotiations?
Yeah. So, I think right now my biggest piece of advice for people in the Iran negotiations is like, take your time. This is going to be a couple more months. Like there'll be breathless news reporting about how we're about to have a major breakthrough or like we're about to have a collapse. Like don't believe any of it. Like let's wait and see. I do think like, and I've said this before, like we're at this moment because, on the one hand, Iran is as weak as it's been since
Right.
1979, right? With all the setbacks it took last year, like in Lebanon with Hezbollah, the collapse of Assad, like the fact that we were able to effectively defend, Israel from the missile strikes from Iran, and then Israel took out a lot of Iran's air defenses. So that kind of creates a condition for this. But also, we have this deadline coming that's really by the end of the summer, like what we call the snapback deadline, which again, it's.
What is snapback? Yeah, just tell people briefly what snapback means.
Right. Snapback means like that all these sanctions potentially come back on Iran. And there's a whole series of sanctions that the Europeans can reapply on Iran, but they can only reapply them because of the way the previous deal was struck until the basically October of this year. If they're not reapplied by this October, then at that point, like that option goes away for Europe, and Iran is way out of compliance with the deal because Trump left the deal, and then Iran started doing a bunch of things and like enriching, and so like we have this deadline coming where if the Europeans do this, the Iranians are going to respond with all kinds of escalatory steps, and we don't know where it goes. But if the Europeans don't do it, then Iran's kind of off the hook from a whole bunch of sanctions while its program continues, and so it's really like a moment of crisis. Which creates opportunity.
Which is often creates opportunity. Hopefully that creates the pressure that actually leads to serious negotiations. This weekend, the Trump team was up at Camp David. They had the whole national security group up there, and they were discussing exactly what they wanted to do. So it's clearly very much a live thing. We've only got a couple of minutes left, Ilan. I did want to note, I know a couple of people had asked us early on just where J Street is at about what's happening in LA. And I think it's really important to just say for folks in LA, I know a number of people who I've seen sign in are from Los Angeles and are part of our Los Angeles chapter out there. And J Street is deeply concerned about the use of the military and the National Guard in domestic in politics. And this is clearly one of the central threats to democracy posed by this administration. And for J Street, protecting American democracy is one of our most important and core priorities. And so we have, consistently spoken out against the use of the military even back in 2019 and 20 when this was first happening in the first Trump administration. And obviously, our thoughts are with the folks out in LA about what you are experiencing, being turned into a prop essentially for the Trump show. But I just want to make sure that that was very clear that the J Street adamantly opposes the use of the military in domestic purposes.
And Jeremy, can I ask you one other question that I saw pop across the screen that I
Yeah.
think is good for people to hear your take on, which is and it's a just important question we always ask here at J Street, which is all right, we have this horrible moment of all these different things happening. What should people be doing right now? Or what would be your recommendation for if you're going to do one thing this week to really push on? Where would you what's an action that folks can be taking coming?
Well, one thing we've got coming up on Saturday is we have the No Kings Day protests. And this, as a resident of the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm sure you feel the same way, I just cannot believe that there are hundreds and hundreds of tanks that are going to be rolling down the streets of Washington, D.C. I mean, it so undercuts everything, that this city should look like and feel like. We're not the city where you have that kind of a military parade, and we're not the country that this administration is leading us towards. This is just horrific. And the No Kings Day rallies are being organized all over the country. I urge J Street groups to put on your J Street hats and T-shirts and meet at a corner so you can go as a group and be part of the pro-democracy movement, be part of taking to the streets. We're going to have to fight this in the Congress, and that's what we do day in and day out. We're going to give a backbone to members of Congress to stand up against what Trump is doing. We're going to have to fight this in the courts. All we can do, make contributions to groups that are leading the legal charge. We're going to have to fight this in the streets by making sure that we are heard and seen and felt, and the opposition grows and grows and grows. And then finally, we're going to have to win this at the ballot box, right? That's the final barricade that we're going to have to take. So fight in the Congress, fight in the courts, fight on the streets, and then win on Election Day in 2026. That's the agenda that we're following. So, Elon, it's great to do these things with you. I can't believe how the hour flies. Thank you to all the people who signed up. Please let your friends and family know about the word on the street. Elon has his own Substack called
Dialogue and Dissonance. You'll also be able to find this there.
Find this at both locations, and we'll be back next week on Monday, and then with a regular weekly time for these conversations. And thank you for joining us. We look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks, Elon.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thanks, everybody.
And welcome back.
Oh, you too.
All right.